So, Dr. Pesta is here, and he received his MA degree in Renaissance Literature
Our toxic
from John Carroll University and his PhD in Shakespeare and Renaissance Literature from Purdue University. Two of my favorite topics. He has taught at major research institutes and small liberal arts colleges on a wide variety of subjects at the graduate and undergraduate level, including classes on Shakespeare, Renaissance literature, the Bible, Russian literature, and C.S. Lewis. He has been active in educational reform and was instrumental in developing and implementing an elective Bible course that is currently available for public high school students in Texas. He is a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh and the academic director of Freedom Project Education, an online school dedicated to providing students a classical education delivered through state-of-the-art technology. Let's welcome Dr. Pesta, please.
Thank you very much for being here today. Can you hear me all right? Microphone be better? You can hear me okay? All right, please. I just want to make sure you can hear me, and I won't walk in front of the screen much. Use the mic, just be careful. Is that better? Okay, good. All right, good. All right, sorry about that. So it's really great to be in Florida. This is my third trip down to Florida to talk about Common Core, and it's one of the states I love because I think you guys have a real opportunity to get rid of this. Not only have you had it longer, so you've seen its detrimental effects better, but you're culturally, Florida is one of those states that shouldn't have this. We've seen South Carolina pull out, we've seen Oklahoma pull out, Texas never took it. This is culturally right in your wheelhouse. If you could, as some of your first speakers said, if you can get to the point where you can convince, particularly your Republican politicians, that the money just isn't worth it, it comes with too many ties and strings, then you're going to be in a really good position, I think, to fight this off. And it's all about knowledge, as your candidates are telling you, that if the more people who just know what this is, the better able you are going to beat it back. And so, as you sit here today, let me ask a question. I always like to begin my talks by asking this. I assume, because you're here today on a beautiful Saturday morning, that most of you are more informed than most of the people in your state about Common Core. But even having said that, would you raise your hand if you are still a little confused about what Common Core is, where it comes from, who's behind it? Let me see a quick show of hands. All right, and so this is as I expected. It's about a third of you who would say that you are. And that shows that you are a more educated audience, but it never hurts, I think, to go and look at the complicated nature of what Common Core is. So the talk that I give, it's an introduction to what it is, it's an explanation of how it functions, and ultimately it touches on what are some of the core dangers that nobody in the establishment who supports it wants to talk about. And that's a problem too. How many of you have, given that we have a lot of activists here, how many of you have heard the same cliches? This is a set of standards, it's not curriculum. We have state and local control in this state, right? How many of you have heard these talking points, that curriculum are not standards? It's just absurd. And so I'd like to go ahead and try to dispel some of that stuff today. So briefly, what is Common Core? Just so we're all on the same page. Common Core is an abbreviated term. It's used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards in English and math with science and history and social studies all forthcoming. Written and copyrighted by the NGA and the CCSSO. Before we even get out of that first sentence, before we even get through that first sentence, I'd like to underscore how duplicitous Common Core is and how it presents itself. We know that nobody anywhere has had a vote on Common Core. That your legislators didn't get to vote on whether to accept it or not, the governors did not, the Senate and the Congress never had any hearings about Common Core. In a very carefully scripted way, the Department of Education pretended to play no part in this. Moms and dads, teachers unions had no say in this. Why in the world did they call them the state standards? It's probably for the same reason they call Obamacare the Affordable Care Act. And sadly, how many of our American fellow citizens, when they hear the word affordable, well, we like affordability, right? You remember these word games Common Core is a hugely bipartisan problem. And in my 33 states, this is my 229th talk in 15 months in 33 states. And in all those states, I have to tell you honestly, the Republicans have been the harder sell than the Democrats. The Democrats just want it. They don't care, they want it, they're unabashedly for it. But trying to convince our Republicans, who intrinsically really ought to know better, it's befuddled by, as your previous speaker said, it's befuddled by money. Right? There's so much money that the state is at least temporarily providing to support this stuff. Well, that makes sense, right? Whenever the federal government wants to do something at a grand scale, take something over, they'll flood your states with money until it's dug deep enough that you can't get rid of it, then the money goes away. It has been conservatively estimated that in about 5 or 6 years, states are going to be on the hook for all that money the feds are now dumping in. They're not going to keep doing it. Once it's in your state to the point that it's almost impossible to pull out, and it's in the country to the point that it's difficult, almost impossible to remove, then the federal government withdraws and your states, all the states, become responsible for this. It's going to be billions and billions of dollars the states are going to have. Rather than collecting hundreds of millions from the federal government, you're going to be paying it in a short time. But they call it the Common Core State Standards for no reason. There is not any evidence, no shred of evidence whatsoever that the states had anything to do with this. In fact, the teachers in the states, the very small number of teachers in the states that actually got to see the standards, didn't even see them until after they were drafted, paid for, developed, revised, verified, and inserted in most states in the union through Race to the Top. Even when your Florida teachers got to see the standards in any meaningful way, they could not revise them, they could not reject them, they could not change them. In what sense is this state-led? Another myth we're going to debunk here is the myth that the governors had something to do with this. You've heard that one too, haven't you? It's a governor's initiative. Well, unfortunately, you've got Mr. Jeb Bush pushing this nonsense. And where do they get the idea that this is a governor's initiative? Because the two groups that are ultimately responsible for the Common Core, the NGA, the National Governors Association, and the CCSSO, these two groups, which are basically nothing more than lobbying groups. The NGA has been described by one of its former sitting governors as a meet and greet place for politicians to be, and their aides to be put in contact with lobbyists. These are not educational organizations, but you hear the word National Governors Association, and it's tempting to say, well, that would be great, right? If 50 state governors locked themselves in a room and banged out education standards. But the problem with that, and I would prefer that to what we have, because if you had 50 state governors get in a room and bang out education standards, then you could unelect the governors if you didn't like what they did. The people who did this, the Common Core people, are utterly unaccountable. They've never been elected to you and me. They're not people we can get our hands on. And with all due respect, I live in Wisconsin. I have arguably the most conservative governor in the country, and he has been fantastic. But he's also been a terrible disappointment on this issue. Politically, he doesn't want to touch it. And I understand Mr. Walker's problem. You remember about 2 years ago, he took on the teachers union in Wisconsin and won and got recalled. And about $250 million of teacher union money then came in from the national unions to try to beat him. He won the recall against them. I understand. So I understand why he's a little hesitant to poke that bear again in an election year. But we need, without his strong leadership, it's not going anywhere in Wisconsin. And so far, after a year and a half of trying to urge and educate, he still is on the fence about what he wants to do. And this is part of the problem. But the NGA, so 50 state governors did do it. So I guess my point in bringing up the governor, Governor Walker, is what qualifications, for as much as I love him, what qualifications does Governor Walker have to write education standards? What qualifications does your governor have to do it? There's not a state in the union that has a governor who could do it. It requires a tremendous amount of sophistication and really a lot of educational experience to be able to craft a standard, particularly in things like math and science, for 60 million American school kids. As one professor, the only professor who was involved on the validation committee of Common Core, and who voted no, by the way, as he points out, there are only 22 mathematicians in this whole country who could do it. Not one of them was consulted in putting the standards together. So if the governors had done it, then we at least could get rid of them. So what is the NGA then? I'll give you one more example that the governors had nothing to do with this. There are a couple of governors who really supported strongly, like Jeb Bush and then Mike Huckabee in Arkansas, but they weren't involved in the writing of the standards. They weren't involved in crafting them or creating them or overseeing them. They're just cheerleading for them. I'll give you an example. Does anybody know who the sitting chair of the NGA is right now? Who is the sitting chair of the National Governors Association? That would be Governor Mary Fallin of Oklahoma. And as you know, 2 months ago, the governor of the state of Oklahoma, the chair of the NGA, she went and pulled the state completely out of Common Core. Now think about that for a second, right? When they tell you this is state-led, ask them for the evidence for this. Every piece of information I'll show you today is documented. And by the way, you can have all these slides. When we're done, we'll quickly throw up a website, or you can see me, I'll give you a card. You can have all this information for free, because it's all documented. And all you get from the supporters of Common Core are talking points, right? How many of you have received the little one-page fact myth sheet, right? Myth, Common Core is federal. Fact, it's state-led. Isn't that awesome? No footnotes, no documentation. And when you ask the teachers or the superintendents or the politicians who hand you that, do they ever tell you how they know that? They don't. So you got these two basic lobbying groups. And I know some of you are taking notes, and one of the names I'd like you to think about or write down so if you're doing further homework is Joy Pullman, P-U-L-L-M-A-N. And Joy has written a definitive article. She works with the Heartland Institute. And she has written a definitive article on who actually wrote Common Core, and it can be traced back to 5 people. Chief among them, David Coleman, C-O-L-E-M-A-N. The New York Times calls David Coleman the most important educational administrator you have never heard of. Coleman has never been elected to any public office. He has never, ever been a classroom teacher. He's never taught. By the way, you know your Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has never been a classroom teacher, right? You know, why in the world would the President of the United States appoint a top educational executive in this country who's never been a classroom teacher? In fact, do you know what Arne Duncan's primary qualifications at school were? He is a sociologist. And you'll see, I know you know this, that Common Core is not an education. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not about education, it's about sociological engineering. And so you got a sociologist in the Department of Education. Do you know what David Coleman's chief recommendation for being the architect of Common Core? And that's what he is. Coleman is the man who oversaw and wrote much of what we now know as Common Core. He is the lead person on this. Do you know what his major qualification was? He was Arne Duncan's roommate in college. That's how he got the job. And even if you think you like the standards, even if you think you do, I doubt we have many of those people here, but even if you think you do, ask yourself this. How in the world does the man who wrote the standards overwhelmingly oversaw them? How does he immediately leave Common Core once they're written and become the CEO of the college boards, where within months of finishing his work with Common Core, he is transforming the college boards, the ACT, to conform to his plan? How does that happen? How does it unelected happen? Not only is David Coleman now, the architect of Common Core, is transforming the test that every single American kid, whether they're Common Core educated or not, within 2 years of the creation, right? Within 2 years, all of these tests that kids have to take to get into college will be Common Core aligned. Do you see that that's a kind of high-level extortion? Yes. Not only is David Coleman rewriting the college boards, he's also now rewriting all the AP tests, all the tests your kids in high school take to get college credit. Have you heard about the new history standards, the new AP history standards? Here's something I would really urge you to do. I just haven't had time, it's so new, I haven't had time to add it to the presentation. Type the letters APUSH into your Google, A-P-U-S-H. APUSH will call up the complete new revision, and we've got it right here, the complete new revision of American history. Your kids are going to be learning now, mandated, if they want any college credit for history, they're going to have to regurgitate things on tests like the Founding Fathers were terrorists, like capitalism is the root cause of all the world's suffering, that America is not a free country, it is a land of imperialism and tyranny and colonialism and racism and sexism. This is now enshrined by the same man who rewriting the ACTs and the SATs, the architect of the Common Core. This is Banana Republic stuff. These people can't be touched. Here, this will blow you away. This is the actual copyright for Common Core. And it's not held by the Department of Education or the federal government or teachers unions or governors or states or moms and dads. It's held by 2 Washington lobbyist groups. How in the world does the transformational educational paradigm that's completely rewriting our schools, how is it owned not by anybody you and I can reach, by the ballot box? How did that happen? This is Banana Republic stuff. This is what happens in third world tin horn dictatorships. And so you ask yourself, you're starting to sound a little conspiratorial up there, Pesta, which maybe for this audience, you get that. But ask yourself the question, well, if the federal government wanted to take over education, why didn't they just do it? Why is there this copyright? Well, because of a 1965 federal statute, a couple of statutes, by the way, the federal government is prohibited. They cannot legally create national standards or a national curriculum. It's illegal. There was no such impediment with healthcare. And so they did the next best thing. The 5 individuals who wrote these standards have deep ties to the president, deep ties, as we see, to the Department of Education. Who paid for all of this? That would be Bill and Melinda Gates initially. Also huge donors, huge lobbyists, money bundlers, ideological co-travelers with the president and his administration. Bill Gates initially, back in 2008 and 9, put up $150 million of his own dollars to pay these 5 individuals with some help to write the standards. As you sit here today, Gates has spent over $4 billion on Common Core. almost all of it going to promote and propagandize for it. And because the Gates Foundation is a public trust with regards to its charitable donations, you could type in online, Bill Gates Common Core spending, and you will see a flow chart where every penny of that $4 billion is gone. And it is shocking. The only educational organizations in this country, the only ones that support Common Core, are the ones he paid. And he's paid hundreds of them. Do you know that way back in 2009, before the standards were even written, Gates had written multiple million-dollar checks to the National Parent Teachers Association. And they were advertising and lobbying for Common Core before they had ever seen the standards. Why did 176 Roman Catholic diocese schools take Common Core without being asked to? Well, the NCEA, the National Catholic Education Association, the chief watchdog of Catholic schools in our country, was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars from Gates to promote these things. There's only one, as far as I can tell, there's only one serious so-called conservative organization that supports them. That's the Fordham Institute. And because it's the only conservative group that really supports it, they're everywhere. And Fordham is supposed to be a conservative think tank. And the irony is that they never tell you when they come and give their talks, Fordham, that they've received about $6 million from Gates in the last 4 years. You can't find anybody who supports Common Core that was not paid handsomely to do so. And so this is how we've got the standards. In what sense are these state-led? In what sense do the governors have any say in this, right? The chief governor, who would theoretically be, who's the head of the NGA, she pulled her state out of it, right? There's no sense in which this was state-led. So, for all of Bill Gates' money, and for all of the crony power that these 5 unaccountable people had in overseeing the writing of the standards, how did they get them into your schools? What power did Gates have to put this junk into your schools? What power does David? Well, money's certainly is helpful, but you guys in particular know this, right? You've been watching government for the last 30 years, particularly at the federal level. You know we have a federal government that doesn't let you do what it does. It's very jealous. In fact, for the last 30 years, our federal government has been much more concerned about letting you do less so it can do more. Do you honestly think the Department of Education at the federal level would have let these people who are unaccountable, who have very little, what is Bill Gates' educational background? Do you honestly think the federal government would have allowed this into your schools if they didn't want it? Do you honestly think some rogue billionaire could have bought his way into the schools this way if the federal government wasn't supportive of that? Ask yourself this. How did it happen? You've all heard of Race to the Top, right? What is Race to the Top? Well, that was a federal program back in 2009, 2010, 2011. It's ongoing. The President of the United States, way back before Common Core was even written, I want you to emphasize that, they created Race to the Top back when they were stimulating things. You remember? They were stimulating banks and car companies, pretty much everything except the economy. Given all that money. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to stimulate education as well. So what they did is they set aside $6 billion initially, and it's much higher now, of federal money, your money, and they doled it out to state education departments. And there were no stipulations. Here, you want to apply in various years for Race to the Top money, apply for grants, and even if you didn't, some states didn't get grants. Even if you didn't get an initial Race to the Top grant, simply by accepting Common Core, you were allowed to sign a Race to the Top contract, and money came in all over the place to your state. Right? Give you an example. Back in 2009, again, before the standards were really written, the state of New York received $700 million from the federal government just for signing up for Race to the Top. And do you know what the only real proviso in Race to the Top was for the states that took it? And we're talking 46 states. Any state that took any Race to the Top money was obligated to accept the Common Core when it was finally written. That's how 46 states got it without seeing it. How in the world is this state-led? So simply by taking the money, this is where we ended up here. Not all states got initial Race to the Top grant money, but all states who have Common Core have money coming in from the federal government, and that's the big allure and draw of it. Now ask yourself this question too. How is this not federal? When they tell you it's not federal, they point to that stupid copyright. And you see how careful the copyright is to tell you it's not federal? It's just us. These two that should bother us, right? That 2 lobbyist groups own the whole thing. Because you can't, how do you get a hold of them? Who do you vote out of office? How are you going to get David Coleman on the line to tell him what you think? Where's the representative government in all of this, given that public education is public? It's ours, it's not theirs. But ask yourself the question I always ask. Do you think The people who support Common Core would continue to do it if the standards were exactly the same. But if instead of the Bill and Melinda Gates people, what if it was the Koch brothers who put up $1 billion? And what if instead of 2 left-leaning lobbyist groups, she had 2 right-leaning ones? And what if instead of a very liberal president, she had a very conservative one, who basically put up about $6 billion of American taxpayer money to bribe a bunch of states to take curriculum standards that they had never seen? And do you think the people who support it now would support it? I don't. I would still be as opposed to it as I am now, if it was coming from the right. The only silver lining of Common Core, if it had happened that way, can you imagine Harry Reid in the Senate if the Koch brothers did it? His head would explode all over the Senate floor, wouldn't it? And yet, you see what I mean about Banana Republic stuff, and you see what I mean too. This is federal. There's nothing in Common Core that would have allowed it to put itself in your schools. Over 40 states took it precisely because of the federal program Race to the Top. And it is the federal government's program, Race to the Top, Arne Duncan and Barack Obama, it is their program that requires states who took money to take the standards. That's the obligation. And that's where we sit today. That's a big myth, that these are state-led. And you think about the way this was done. This is, say what you will about the Affordable Care Act, say what you will about health care. It had its hearing in the House and the Senate, it went to the Supreme Court. This is equally, I think this is more transformational than that. And it's never had any of those things. And again, I respectfully insist that the only reason it's in your schools, and if this isn't federal, so you're bribing states to take it, right? Here's a big wad of money, and all you have to do is accept something you haven't seen. Now you're bribing states who want to get out. How about, is it Lee County? Oh man, the country was just weeping for you, Florida, when you had a school board that initially, the first one in Florida that tried to pull out. And then they got to that one woman, didn't they? And what was the big concern why she recanted her vote at the 11th hour? We're going to lose out on a lot of federal money. So the federal government now, that has nothing to do with this, who bribed states like Florida to take it, is now telling states like Florida and states that want to back out like Indiana or Oklahoma, well, you can, but if you back out, we're going to withhold your entire federal education budget. This has nothing to do with the federal government, but you bribe states to take it and you're blackmailing states to try to get out of it. Do you know that about 6 months ago, Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education, began sending federal agents into various schools across the country just to be sure that those schools and school districts were implementing Common Core the way the federal government thought it ought to be implemented. You've got, and this is easy, you can check that out online. Arne Duncan is sending federal agents into schools across this country to make sure they're putting this in exactly the way the federal government wants it. But your benighted politicians and benighted school officials who support this, they're going to tell you we have state and local control. It's not federal. One thing I like to do, particularly for an audience like this, is useful. We live in a strange world, and you're one of the audiences that I speak to that really understands this. If you amass a bunch of facts on a subject, but you happen to be a conservative or a Christian or a Republican, suddenly your facts don't make any sense because you are a tinfoil hat wearing right-winger. So you are immediately dismissed, and I confess to being all of those things, a Christian, a conservative, and by definition, a tinfoil hat wearing nut job, because that's what we all are, right? That's how they treat us. So what I like to do during this talk is to take about 25 minutes and show you all the right-wing lunatics who support Common Core, who oppose it. That's the only thing they have. And all the talks that I've given, that's all they come back with. They never engage with the data, they never answer. And when you try to talk to your schools about how we got Common Core, look, they're going to tell you. It doesn't matter, they're just standards. Let's talk about the standards. As if it's somehow, who's paying for it doesn't matter. As if somehow the ideological motivation, or legally or illegally how they got it, doesn't matter. Your schools will not discuss any of this. Your politicians who support Common Core will not discuss all this stuff. They're just standards, let's talk about the standards. Okay, so what I do is, I start by demonstrating that Common Core is anything but a right-wing, merely a right-wing concern. So let's look at some of the right-wingers. Let's start with the 2 Department of Education lawyers in 2009 who oversaw at the legalities, the legal side of the Department of Education. 2 Democrats. They both quit over this. They resigned immediately when Common Core was put in place, and they called it a federal takeover of education. Right? In imposing here they are, Kent Talbert and Robert Eitel. Here's what they said back in 2009. In imposing the Common Core standards on the states, listen to the verb there, by the 2 lawyers at the Department of Ed, whose job it is to make sure that the Department of Education is in legal compliance with the laws. They said, in imposing Common Core and the test on the states, the federal government is violating 3 statutes and has put America on the road to a national curriculum. That's the second thing that makes it federal. The only reason it's in your schools is because of the federal Race to the Top program, or the federal money that is supporting it. That's the only way. And the tests, all these national tests that your kids have to take, they don't report to the states or the teachers. They report directly back to the Department of Education and the federal government. You understand, right, that whoever controls the tests controls the curriculum? Your teachers think, and you keep hearing this from some Florida teachers and school administrators, we'll be able to take Common Core and adapt it and adopt it. How in the world are you going to do that when the tests kick in? Bill, I'll show you the quote in a minute. Bill Gates himself said in 2009, when the tests align to the standards, the curriculum will follow as well. That's a feature of this, and he's right. The minute the tests kick in, your teachers, whatever they think they're going to be able to do, are going to be handcuffed. Because the only way of assessing Common Core is these stupid tests, these national tests. You know, there are schools all across the country now, including schools in Florida, who have already came out and said they will no longer offer their own midterm and final exams in the classrooms to their kids. In other words, and the argument, well, our kids are going to be testing so much nationally, it's not fair for us to offer our own tests. So think, Common Core is really just ramping up here, and your schools are already saying, we will not independently test the kids anymore. So the teachers who are teaching your kids will not offer final exams and midterm exams because the kids take enough national testing. Do you see what a seeding that already is of control of who controls your kids? In imposing, notice the verb, forcing the Common Core standards and the test on the states, the government's violating 3 of its 3 national statutes and put America on the road to a national curriculum. With respect to Race to the Top Common Core scheme, Eitel and Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the Department of Ed, concluded that, quote, these standards and the tests will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in those states that took it, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program, and raising a fundamental question about whether the department is exceeding its statutory boundaries. Not only did they quit, but the 2 of them have now written a book together. I haven't had time to read it yet. It's relatively new. It's called The Coming Federal Takeover of Education. But don't worry, your superintendent of schools tells you it's not federal. Right? How about this? How about these right-wing kooks? Help me out. I'm an English professor, but I need your help with words. I'm going to give you 5 words. You tell me if there's any way you can rearrange these 5 words to make it come out conservative. New York State Teachers Union. Any way you can, I'm puzzled, right? Because I want you to look at the dates of the slides I'm about to show you. This starts in January of this year. All the information you're about to see comes from this year, after states have had a little more time to look at it. And New York is exactly in the same boat you are. New York is one of 3 states that has had Common Core longer than the rest of the country. You guys, Florida, New York, Kentucky, you are the 3 rollout states. You are the 3 states that got it and had it in your schools and had the textbooks well before Wisconsin and Ohio and most of the rest of the states had it. You've seen more of this. Right? And New York is a much more progressive state than you are. And they're now struggling with this. And it's not just, again, us right-wing lunatic types that are struggling with it. In January of 2014, here's what the New York Teachers Union did. The Teachers Union, the board of New York State Teachers Union on Saturday unanimously voted to withdraw support for Common Core standards as they are being implemented, and they declared no confidence in the superintendent of schools who brought them there. The New York State United Teachers, a union that represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in New York, is also asking the State Board of Regents to fire State Education Commissioner John King, the man who brought it to the state. And although the union previously backed the standards, the union says it will not support the benchmarks, either as implemented or interpreted. That's big. We're not taking, we don't want your standards, and however you try to tweak them, we're not going to want them then if you mess with them. We don't want them. That's huge when you think about it. And what happened in New York that makes them so leery now? Well, the first year they got the standards, they thought they could do whatever they wanted because they had state and local control. So they taught the Common Core, but they also changed it up, and they used a lot of their other time to unteach some of the Common Core lessons. And then, lo and behold, they got their first Common Core test, prototype Common Core test. And the teachers recognized they can't teach what they want. And the second year of Common Core in New York, they had to now go to teach exactly to what was in the test. That, and you understand this is a big deal, right? Teachers' unions are some of the most radically progressive things in the country, and the New York Teachers Union is really bad. And even, you know how it is in unions, right? Rank and file teachers may be Republican or Democrat or anything in between, but to be a union boss, you don't have any right-wing credentials. How about this? That's not enough for you. How about the country's largest teachers union? How about the NEA? The NEA is now the most powerful union in the country. Now that the UAW has been tamped down, the teachers union, the NEA, spends more money on lobbying and activism than any union in the country, and 99% of that money goes directly to liberal causes. $250 million of teacher union dues went to fight Governor Walker in the state of Wisconsin. That's what they spend their money on. And notice the date, February 2014. The nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for Common Core, labeling the rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education Association President Dennis Van Rokel said, quote, the standards will not succeed without a major course correction, including rewriting the standards and revising the tests with teacher input. Yeah, you heard that right. The tests that your kids are going to have to take were not written by teachers. Teachers don't get to grade them. Teachers, in many instances, aren't even going to get to see the results. When we say high-stakes testing, we mean high stakes for the teachers. Because that's how we evaluate teachers now. If your teachers can't get kids to this standard, to satisfy not even satisfying the principals anymore, or their local school districts, or the governors, the states of your states. Now, if you don't get your kids to the standard that the federal government wants, as a teacher, you may lose your job, you may not get tenure. You're a principal of a school that can't get enough kids to the standard, you're replaced. This is shockingly unfair to teachers. How in the world do you hold teachers accountable for a set of curriculum standards they didn't write and had no say in, and tests they didn't write, don't get to grade, and don't even get to see? You see how much power is being ceded? Everybody knows that the way kids learn, and every study has shown that the way kids learn best is when you have a committed parent, a disciplined child, and an effective teacher. That's all you need. I'm quoting a video clip I'll show you later. You know, we became a superpower in this country on the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. That's what works, right? Teachers, moms and dads, and students. And yet, Common Core is 180 degrees removed from that. Everything is regulated federally. What goes on in your classrooms now is not being determined by the teachers who know your kids, see what they need, know what the community's like that the kids came out of. Your teachers are utterly handcuffed. Do we have any teachers here? Well, then you know, right, that there are sometimes you just have to throw out the curriculum with a group of kids. You may have 30 kids, you have to throw out the lesson plan. Sometimes you just have to go completely off script and be creative to get that group of kids to learn something. How do you do that when the whole thing is scripted, enforced, and tested nationally? How do you do that? This is what's at stake at this. How about this? All right? So, no teacher input. How about the second biggest teachers union in the country? How about the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers? And by the way, as radically progressive as the NEA is, the AFT, the second largest teachers union, that's considered to be more radical. That's where the teachers go, the AFT, who don't think the NEA is left-wing enough. But check this out, and notice the date, July of this year. In a major surprise, of course it is, the AFT, this country's second largest teachers union, opened its convention Friday by announcing a step back from Common Core. AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, will now provide monetary grants for teachers to critique the standards or write new ones. They're paying their teachers to write better standards. The AFT's Executive Council also introduced a resolution declaring that the standards may have had noble intentions, but they have fallen short due to outside meddling and an inordinate focus on standardized testing. CCSS has also seen other opposition on the left as well, particularly from a new faction of almost 100,000 left-wing teachers who have named themselves the Badass Teachers Organization. This is a group of teachers within the AFT, 100,000, who don't think the AFT is progressive enough. So they've called themselves the Badass Teachers, and they are fighting Common Core tooth and nail, right? So because that's their whole strategy. When they dismiss you as a kook, what they're going to tell you when you fight this, you're a right-winger, we're not going to listen to you. You don't have an education degree, we're not going to listen to you, right? You heard that one? Hell, I've heard that one. I've got 2 master's degrees and a PhD, and I teach education majors every semester. And I hear you have no business to talk about this because you don't have a degree in education. But when they do that to you, you ask them this: what's Bill Gates' education background? What's Arnie Duncan's education background? What's David Coleman's education background? What's the people who wrote the standards education? They don't have it. Not enough. That doesn't bother them. We're criticizing it and we're invalidated because we don't have education degrees. But the people who wrote and implemented the standards have no meaningful education background, and yet they're exonerated from that criticism. How about my personal favorite? How about the Chicago Teachers Union? President Obama's. You know, when you want to talk about state teachers unions, these guys are the loopiest. This is the same group, the Chicago Teachers Union, who a couple years ago approved a curriculum that would sanction the teaching of masturbation techniques to 5-year-olds, kindergarten kids. You know who their commencement speaker was, their Martin Luther King Day speaker was for elementary school kids this year? Elementary school kids. The Reverend Jeremiah Wright. So these are some of the right-wing kooks who oppose Common Core. Now here's what Karen Lewis said. There she is, the Teachers Union president. She's now running for mayor of Chicago, Karen is, right? And here's what she says about Common Core, quote, "I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy." Karen's telling you that's data mining. All this stuff they're going to be gathering on your kids and your school denies is going to happen, right? Overreach of federal power into personal privacy as well as into state educational autonomy. There's your state and local control. It's going away. How about this? Common Core, quote, "eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. We also know that high-stakes standardized testing is designed to rank and sort our children, and it contributes significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in our schools." And she's right. You know where the biggest agreement between the right and the left on Common Core is? What it does to special needs kids and what it does to kids who are already behind and struggling, many of which are inner city minority kids. Right? That's where this is coming from. That's a damning indictment in President Obama's own backyard. Not only did the Chicago Teachers Union president say that, the entire union drafted 30 anti-Common Core resolutions. I can't show you all of them, I'll show you a couple of them. Here's what the resolution says. Instructional and curricular decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals. This wasn't done. The people writing and grading and crafting, they weren't educated. The instructional and curricular decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the context and interests of your students. Do you honestly believe some bureaucrat in Washington better knows what kids in Ocala or places like Orlando need? Right? That one-size-fits-all education emanating from Washington is going to be able to help kids in Miami and kids in rural Florida who need radically different things to even get started. And conservative people and Christian people, we always get suckered because you hear the word standards, right? And that's how the Common Core people phrase this. If you oppose Common Core, you just don't want standards. You know, for 200 years in this country, when you had teachers giving tests and grades and moms and dads sending their kids to school, you had a standard. And it worked. Right? The idea that without Common Core, well, but we've heard that before, right? You remember that if you didn't support the Affordable Care Act, you wanted people to die in the streets? And do you remember how if you don't support the latest radical agenda on abortion, it's a war on women? Yeah? This is the same thing. They're trying to threaten you. If you don't support Common Core, then you just don't want standards. And as conservative, Christianity, by definition, is the world's golden standard, isn't it? Everything we do as Christians and conservatives, religious people, it's standards-based. So the idea that somehow that only the bigger the standard is, the better, is absolutely absurd here. How about this? Education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate information, practice. You've heard listen who's telling you this, the Teachers Union in Chicago. Common Core is developmentally inappropriate. Not only is it age inappropriate, why? Why so much sex? Why so much violence? Why so much graphic stuff in the Common Core materials? Why all these lesson plans being pulled out of Common Core textbooks? You saw the other one just the other day, I think it was from Massachusetts, I believe it was, or Michigan, I get my M's mixed up, about they were comparing Bush to Hitler. Did you see that? Yeah. What's all this doing in there? They're telling you it's inappropriate. How about this? Common Core standards were developed by non-practitioners, non-educators, including test and curriculum publishers, right? In other words, the people who are behind this are making a lot of money providing the information for it. You know who the second biggest private donor to Common Core is after Bill Gates? It's Pearson Publishing. Pearson owns 100% of the Canadian textbook market. You can't buy a Canadian textbook that's not Pearson. Pearson already owns 80% of the American textbook market. And over the last 2 years, they've bought 40 different small presses in America, paying 5 and 6 times what they're worth. They want the same monopoly. And you know, right, that Pearson has the exclusive contract with the federal government to produce, write, and score all the tests. You know, Pearson makes about $30 on every test your kids take. And by the way, what's being an English professor, what's 30 times 60 million? Do you know last year alone, your federal government, your federal government paid Pearson $350 million to develop and implement the materials. And when Pearson wrote them, they charged the states for them and kept the money. Why is your federal government paying a private company $350 million to produce all this information and not requiring the money back? And giving Pearson tax breaks for doing it? Here's a definition of Common Core for you, my first one. Common Core is an out-of-control, it's an unholy alliance between an out-of-control federal government and a very small group of crony capitalist companies who are making billions off of this. Give me this, look at Bill Gates for a second. The idea that Bill Gates is somehow this neutral actor. It's been estimated that over 70% of American school districts, 70, are going to have to upgrade their technology, a little or a lot. Whose computers do you think are going into those schools? Do you honestly think it's Apple computers? The idea that there is no quid pro quo. What do you think? You think Pearson's getting $350 million from the federal government to go out and make tests and then sell them for their own profit and has no reciprocal agreement with the federal government of the United States? That's what they're telling you here. Non-practitioners, including test and curriculum publishers, and education reform foundations are behind Common Core. Groups like the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, Achieve Inc., over and over and over. These left-wing 501c3s are pushing all this educational change, right? And the Chicago Resolution says that as a result, the standards better reflect the interests and priorities of corporate education reformers than the best interests and priorities of students. Now, we've been saying this for a year and a half, right? 2 years. But we have the wrong letters before our name. When they tell you you're just a kook, well, the irony is that Karen Lewis really is a kook. But she's a kook who's on your side, right? How about these radical right-wingers? The most liberal news magazine in the country is Salon.com. And Michael Mazenko is one of their editors. Here's what liberal Salon said just in July of this year. Right? The underreported story about Common Core is the millions of dollars to be made developing and selling education materials and tests linked to the new standards. We've already blown up 4 major Common Core myths. State-led, governor-led, right? How about this one? You've heard this one? Standards aren't curriculum. Common Core is just standards, it's not curriculum, so all these bad assignments you see has nothing to do with Common Core. It's just the textbooks. Well, the textbooks were written by Pearson and others in conjunction with the people who wrote the standards. Before the standards were even written fully, Pearson was talking to the Common Core people about how they would produce the curriculum to meet the standards. As a matter of fact, your teachers just showed up in class one year, they went home in the summer, they came back in the fall, all the books had been removed and Common Core books were in their places. There was no way to train your teachers. Your principals didn't know how to do it, they didn't even know what it was. Your superintendents of schools didn't know how to train your teachers. What's the only tools your teachers had to learn how to teach Common Core? It was the textbooks. And if you've seen Common Core textbooks, you'll know the whole book does the teaching for them. You've got the stories they read, all the questions the teachers are supposed to ask in the margins, the quizzes, the writing assignments, the assessments are all in the back. Your teachers, who'd never even been told what Common Core was intellectually or philosophically, were handed books, the books did the teaching. The curriculum is the standards. There is no other way to teach it. You can't go and find non-Common Core ways to teach Common Core. All you have is the materials that were produced years ago and put into your schools. When they tell you that curriculum isn't standards, they're just standards, that's nonsense. The standards are meaningless without the tools you use to implement them, and there are no tools that aren't written by these companies who are making billions off of this. You see how, that's the one that bothers me the most. Because they'll do it to you all the time. You start talking to them about this stuff, and they'll say, they won't even talk to you about it. They're just standards. Let's talk about the standards. We'll talk about the standards. But this stuff is pretty shocking. This is what Mazenko says. Despite claims by Common Core advocates that standards are not curriculum. Schools are realizing they need to spend money on new materials and training to meet the new expectations of the standards, especially if the schools are required to do standardized tests, and all of them are. Right? Without doubt, the implementation of Common Core will cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and the U.S. Department of Education is already paying $350 million to education companies like Pearson to develop that curriculum and those tests. Clearly, the Common Core has been incredibly lucrative for businesses, while the benefit to students remains dubious at best. Right? How about this? 1 year ago, only 12% of American teachers opposed Common Core. In 1 year's time, that number is now 40%. What happened in 12 months? They saw it. Right? And remember, most states in the union aren't like you. You've seen it longer. You've had more years to see it. Places like Wisconsin, teachers have now seen it for 1 year, and they're starting to run away. The reason more teachers don't speak out about Common Core, think about it. If the teachers union in your state, like Wisconsin, supports Common Core, and the educational establishment supports Common Core in Wisconsin, you're a Wisconsin teacher who hates Common Core. Who's going to defend you if you speak out? Your school administrators are insisting you support it, and your union backs it. Notice what's happened in places like New York and Chicago since the unions pulled out of Common Core? Now New York and Chicago teachers are screaming bloody murder about how much they hate it, because the unions got their back now. Do you understand that if we put our teachers in a position, and you're Florida, you're same situation. Your administration establishment wants Common Core, and the unions in Florida have stood behind it. Where do your teachers go if they oppose this? Nowhere, they can't. But in places where the unions are starting to crack, this is a Harvard University, Stanford University study on education. Only 46% of teachers now say they back the standards, compared to 76% 1 year ago. And what do you think is going to happen? 44 states in the union have not seen any Common Core testing yet. What do you think happens this year after those states get it? Because it was the testing that drove New York and Chicago and California, some California teachers' unions, to run away from it. They saw it firsthand. What do you think is going to happen when that testing hits in all those other states? What's going to happen to those numbers? This is Josh Katz. He is in Orange County, Florida, which is, what, about an hour from here? Yeah. Okay. Here, Josh is a self-described progressive high school math teacher. He's doing exactly what I'm doing. He's traveling the country, warning moms and dads about Common Core. And again, liberal progressive, I want you to listen quickly to a short clip of his, because I think it helps crystallize what our problems with Common Core are.
Our toxic culture of education begins with a classic supervillain archetype. I focus on Syndrome from The Incredibles. The supervillain's plan is to unleash a doom onto the world that only the supervillain can stop, thus gaining all the desired power. Now, this is exactly what happened in education in the 1980s and before, and then culminated in No Child Left Behind. Private education companies realized they could use public education, a multi-billion-dollar industry, to create a nearly endless stream of taxpayer money. They channeled millions of dollars into lobbying efforts and focused on two words, rigor and accountability, and put everything into place. State statutes were passed, district rules were enforced, and then finally No Child Left Behind became the national standard. Don't get me wrong about politics. These efforts were underway long before they were passed, so both parties get to take full credit for their disastrous results, especially with Race to the Top. We somehow took the education system that produced the individuals who put a man on the moon with technology less powerful than the phone in my pocket and characterized that education system as a failure, using the word accountability. We only have one way to address accountability: standardized testing. So we implemented standardized testing, and then a 1983 publication called A Nation at Risk showed standardized tests proved schools were failing, teachers were failing, students were failing, and when everything is failing, guess what we need? New textbooks, new workbooks, new resources, new training, accountability systems, new schools, private schools, charter schools, and who is it that creates all of these things that all of a sudden we need? Our supervillain, private education companies. The only way to feed a business model in this toxic culture of education is to perpetuate a picture of failure. I would love to meet any education company that has a business model that is built upon long-term student success. There simply is no money in long-term student success. Now, how is it that we can believe that a standardized test is what accurately measures student achievement? How can we believe that it measures student growth? That moment when the student's light bulb is finally lit, aha. That moment when a student says, thank you for helping him graduate with a 2.0 GPA. How can we attach a number to that moment when a third grader finally has the ability to write his own name? Who, by the way, has been labeled a failure for himself, his teacher, and his school. Yet we crave education standardization. We believe we need these high-stakes tests because we eat up the misinformation provided by these companies and policies using a false validity of their testing results. Our testing culture begins in elementary school. Colleagues of mine work with third graders who suffer from anxiety from high-stakes testing. From a one-day, one-shot, 4-hour computer-based test, the future path of a student is set, an academic identity is established, and a message is delivered loud and clear. Either you can or you can't make it. And no matter what the teacher tells the student about how good they are or what talents they have, if the student doesn't score well on that high-stakes test, the third graders know exactly what it means and begin to define themselves. And it's starting to happen now in kindergarten. So we continue this barrage of standardized tests, and the students continue failing, and the districts have to continue the next initiatives that can solve the problems. Who is it that manufactures these products? Who creates these solutions? Our supervillain. Private companies like Pearson and McGraw-Hill, who operate off policy and legislation written by nonprofit organizations and lobbying groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. The Common Core will do even more damage because of its emphasis on high-stakes testing matched with its myopic standards that are disguised in critical thinking. I've seen my daughter's kindergarten and first grade assignments. This isn't critical thinking. This is developmentally inappropriate rote. You think they could fool me with this stuff? Any education reform that doesn't address high-stakes testing and the non-cognitive factors of true success like character and integrity is a complete waste of time, and it's killing our kids.
And it's killing our kids. Now, he's right about so many things, but I'd like to take one moment and tell you something I think he's wrong about. As a progressive liberal, he makes a classic liberal mistake. The supervillain, the villain that's more responsible than all the others, is the private capitalist company. Now, you just heard me blast this crony capitalism of people like Pearson, right? I have no use for it. But it's interesting that Mr. Katz can't recognize the fact that none of this would be in your schools if the federal government, the watchdog of public education, didn't let it. Do you honestly think that Pearson could be in your schools like this if the feds didn't want them there? Well, you've already seen. The feds are paying them millions of your dollars to be there. This gentleman is just up the street from you. You should consult with him on this, right? This is no right-wing guy. And a couple of things, I played it because a couple of things I want you to recognize. He's right, absolutely, and I wanted to give him credit for it. He's right. From 1911 all the way through the 1970s, American schools were preeminent in the world. We put men on the moon, we educated kids to put men on the moon with less technology than you have in your stupid little cell phone. And we characterized that education system a failure. Who did that? The teachers didn't characterize it a failure. The students didn't suddenly start not knowing things. Your school districts and schools didn't do it. It was testing companies. And you know when it happened? Not surprisingly, I know you're going to be absolutely blown away to hear this. You know when this started? When we created the Department of Education. Right, in the late 70s, right? The previous iteration of our current president, his doppelganger in the 70s, right? For 200 years in this country, we educated our kids at a very high level without a centralized Department of Education. And in the late 1970s, we created one, and what immediately happened? The Department of Ed had to justify its own existence, right? So they got, and the textbook, the publishing companies realized that all that money was being pumped, now that was all going to the schools, that local school districts were having, all that money now was being first pumped into the federal government at the Department of Ed. So the textbook companies realized that, hey, if we get our hands in that pie, that money will come to us. So the textbook companies like Pearson, they created tests that quote unquote proved in the early 1980s that American schools sucked. And when you prove that, guess what happens? You throw out everything and you've got to buy all new textbooks. We've been doing math the same way in the West for 2,500 years. It's given us Archimedes and Galileo and Newton and Einstein. And you know, if you know anything about math, you know, right, that from kindergarten through high school, nothing has changed mathematically. The numbers, the formulas, it's all the same. So what do we keep buying new math textbooks for? You know what you're doing? You're buying all this social engineering junk, all this diversity initiatives and multiculturalism, all this stuff that has nothing to do with adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. Remember, we're old enough to remember the new math, aren't we? Well, what is Common Core? But what did you do, invent the numbers again? And here we are with Common Core math, which is a complete reinvention of something that didn't need to be reinvented in the first place. But as Mr. Katz points out, if I'm right, math hasn't changed, certainly not at the high school down level in all these centuries. If that hasn't, millennia, if that hasn't happened, you buy one math textbook and it's good for 50 years. There's no success in student achievement. If you're Pearson Publishing, you sell that one textbook and then 50 years later you come back and say, okay, anybody want another book? And that doesn't cut it for these companies. So you see what's happened in the last 40 years? Interestingly, corresponding exactly to when American schools started to fail. It's the standardization that's failing them. It's the nationalization that's failing them. How many of you got kids or grandkids? All of you. Can you get your 2 daughters and your 5 grandkids, could you get them all to get the exact same marks in all single subject areas? Of course you can. And if you can't do it in your families where you have some control, how are you going to do it with 60 million American school kids? Let's do the math that your schools refuse to do. Right? Education. That's the other thing I want to say. All right, fine. If you don't have an education degree, you have to shut up about education. But who is it that's put us in this problem in the last 40 years? Isn't it PhDs in education? Right? In typical big government fashion, the same people who screwed it up are telling you you have no right to talk about it or fix it. It's shocking. Math. We've been doing math the same way all these years, and now all of a sudden, we need all these different ways to do it. The supervillain, right? Remember my definition. It's an unholy alliance between an out-of-control federal government and a small group of crony capitalist companies. And the thing about this union, what do the companies get out of this? The companies get money, lots and lots of money. What does the federal government get out of this? Control. You get this, right? You remember back in the old Nazi days, in the 1930s, right? All those companies, the very small group of companies that were allowed to work with the government and get rich. Companies like Volkswagen, right? Like the various chemical companies that worked with them. No sooner did the feds, the nationalists, the socialists, actually the Nazis, no sooner did they consolidate their power than the private companies went away after colluding, right? And you saw this in Soviet Russia. It's the same thing again and again. And Katz is exactly right about that. It's a dangerous thing. And if you don't believe me, how about this right-winger? How about Bill Gates? The man himself. Go back to 2009, when he was putting the whole scheme together and paying for it. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well. How do you get around? How do you write that off? How do your educational administrators and your feckless politicians who support this, how do they come to grips with the fact that the man who's orchestrating this is telling you that once we get our tests, once we get our standards into your schools, and then we start testing nationally, we get to determine what's taught. He who controls the tests controls what goes on in the classrooms. Do you know Common Core has already begun the process of renaming your teachers? They're not called teachers in the brand new Common Core textbooks. They're called facilitators. You understand why, right? Because there will be no teachers in the future. Teaching means that you have independent agency to dictate where things go. Now it's all scripted. In Wisconsin, we actually have teachers teaching math and English who aren't told until 1 week before they teach what they will teach. And they're getting faxes from the Department of Education in Wisconsin schools saying, okay, next week here's your slate. Here's what you'll talk about. Detailed scripts from Washington telling them, next week when you teach, here's what you're going to teach and how you're going to do it. So, and that blows up myth number 8, doesn't it? We have state and local control. Do you see what this is? By design? It's the death of state and local control. And you know, let's talk about standards, because this is where a lot of conservative people get hung up. Well, we need standards. We've got them. We've always had them. Do you know that there have been 50 different academic studies done in the last 40 years, 50, that demonstrate conclusively there is no correlation, zero correlation between state and national standards and how your kids perform in the classroom? That's absolutely shocking. We have no data whatsoever. You can go ahead and set the highest standards you want in Florida or at the national level. It has not the slightest impact on how your kids do. Because what does a state standard have to do with what goes on in a particular classroom? State standards are just suggestions. All that matters is what your teachers are able to get your kids to do. And we are not allowing them to do it. That's why it's failing. Here's the latest one. This is the most comprehensive. This one was published just about 4 months ago. This is the Brookings Institute, right, which is a left-leaning think tank. And the last 30 minutes now you've seen, right? Every single piece of information I've given you has come from the left. I've been saying this for a year and a half. They're saying it now. Good, good. Because in our twisted little world, and I could have spent 5 hours showing you Christians and conservatives blasting this stuff with data and documentation. But somehow, in our culture, it just doesn't quite have the punch, right? Put a D before your name. This is the Brown Center report, the most thorough, done about 4 months ago. And the Brookings Institute is not a conservative organization. Here's their summation. You can find their report online free. What effect will the Common Core have on national achievement? The analysis presented here says very little impact. The quality of Common Core standards is being hotly debated, but the quality of past curriculum standards is unrelated to student achievement. And the rigor of performance standards, how high you make them, is unrelated. Think about this. Let's do the math that the schools won't do. You want to get all your kids in every single class to a specific place. Ultimately, in order to get more kids on board, are you going to have to raise the standard or lower it? It's common sense. Even No Child Left Behind, the disaster, speaking of Bushes, that George Bush orchestrated, right? No Child Left Behind. Whatever standards they started with initially, they continue over 12 years, had to lower them because kids can't reach them. If the goal is to get all kids to the same place, that place is going to necessarily be a lot lower than higher. That's why these things don't work. Let schools figure it out. Empower schools to do it. And so, one last brief history lesson, and then we coast to the end of the presentation. The Common Core, one of the other things I want to do, besides exploding the ridiculous talking points, and I know you see this now, right? You can't do Common Core in 20 minutes. You can't do talking point versions of Common Core. That's what the left does. Here's a couple bullet points. It's state-led, it's governor-led, it's standards, not curriculum. All right, and they pass this out in the schools, and what percentage of our moms and dads who just read that think, oh, okay, that's fine. This whole thing was dug deep. It was widely thought out. It is conspiratorial how it was done behind closed doors. You can't do this in 5 minutes. And the other thing I'd like to do, besides blowing up all those myths and showing you what Common Core really is I would like to deconstruct some of this stuff as well. The idea that Common Core was transparent or open, if this is such a good thing, why is it cloaked in so much mislabeling, secrecy, lying, deceit? You know, people like me and Josh Katz and hundreds of others of us are touring the country lecturing about why Common Core is bad. Where do you go to hear a pro-Common Core speech? You know what you can't? You know how often we've begged them to stand on stage with us and debate us? If what we're doing is so transparently wrong, it should be the easiest thing in the world to poke holes in what we do. They will not debate it. They will not do talks like this for you. They will not come out in public. And when you try to talk to them in the schools that your kids go to, they will not let you talk to them collectively. They will not open up the auditorium, bring 100 moms and dads, and no, one by one they'll let you come in. Do you know Arnie Duncan sent a memo to all American schools saying, do not talk to people collectively about Common Core. Insist on talking to them, because if they bring you into the superintendent's office, your mom or a dad, they bring you into the principal's office and isolate you from everybody else who doesn't like Common Core, then they tell you, right, we're not getting any complaints. This is your problem, right? It's intimidation. If this is so good, it should be easy enough to prove. Well, Common Core did one other disgusting thing that you might be tempted to think was a good thing. Way back in 2009-10, when they had written the standards, they created a panel called the Validation Committee. They brought in a bunch of people, paid a bunch of people to come in and look at the standards, and if they weren't any good, throw them out. Or they get complete carte blanche to change, to throw the standards away, to start over, tear them up and start over, whatever they wanted to do. Interestingly, on this committee of 29, they only brought in one expert of English and one expert of math. That's it. They brought in a bunch of activists, they brought in some low-level middle school and high school teachers, and again, please recognize what I'm telling you. If you teach high school geometry, that's great. We need good high school geometry teachers. But a high school geometry teacher does not have enough math to be able to assess a national standard. There were only 2 people on the committee who could. 2. The math professor is a guy by the name of Professor James Milgram, a Stanford University math professor, retired. He's serious. This is the guy that Milgram did much of the math calculations for the Apollo moonshot in the late 60s. He's got that kind of math. And he said of Common Core, by the way, he voted no. To throw them out entirely, he said, quote, it's an absolute joke to think that Common Core math will prepare your kids for college-level math or even for STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, and math. It won't do it. The English professor was Dr. Sandy Stotsky. She's been to your state a couple times already. And Sandy is considered to be the foremost ELA specialist for developmental kids in the country. She also voted no. By the way, Stotsky and Milgram are both Democrats. Stotsky also voted no. And she said, quote, the new standards in English and reading will set our kids 2 years behind the rest of the world when it comes to reading and reading and English comprehension. These two experts convinced other people on the panel to vote no. And do you know what happened? The Common Core Committee just kind of wrote them out of the final document and validated anyway. Simply removes them, their paid experts, from the discussion and validated with the people who were for it. That's what happened. And when you talk to your administrators about this, they're just standards. Let's talk about the standards. They're not going to talk to you about this. So that's why Stotsky and Milgram are both traveling the country, warning people of what this junk is. So this comes directly from standards. Here's what my second definition of Common Core. Look at Common Core as a stool. And a stool needs 3 legs to stand or it's going to fall. Each of the 3 legs is equally valuable because you pull one out, the thing collapses. Here are the 3 legs, you've seen them. 1, the federal government. The only reason it's in your schools, bribing states to take it and blackmailing states who don't want it or want to get out of it. The federal government, the Common Core people, and then the textbooks companies, the publishers. These 3 things are what Common Core is, and you cannot separate them or the whole thing collapses. So having taken that into account, this comes directly from Sandy. Well, we know in Common Core English, right, through the text, the only thing we have to teach is the textbooks. That Common Core, up to 50% in Common Core English of the literature that our kids have historically read in classrooms is being pulled in favor of informational texts, much of which comes directly from the federal government. So as Sandy points out, our kids, when you read the great classics, whether it's Huckleberry Finn or Hamlet or the Odyssey, you don't know what Homer's politics were. You don't know if Homer was a Democrat or a Republican. You read great literature because you involve with ideas and concepts. And when you put your kids to bed at night, why do you read them stories that make their little eyelids flutter and their hearts pound? If you want to put kids to bed at night, shouldn't you read them a Bill Gates computer manual? I mean, wouldn't that happen right after? But you don't, because we know that kids learn how to read and love reading through stories. Much of that storytelling is being yanked out and being replaced by government propaganda. Here's some examples. They're called informational texts. By the time your daughter's in 9th grade English, she'll be exposed to things like recommended levels of insulation, a report released in 2010 by the EPA and the Department of Energy. I've read it. It's a 40-page regulatory manual that simply talks about the environmentally correct way to insulate a building. Is this the kind of stuff that's going to make your kid want to read? And all of it, as Sandy points out, is one-sided government leftist propaganda. She says about 40%, and you can see them online, about 40% of the informational texts deal with man-made global warming. Nothing contradicts it, it's all for it, and almost every one of these global warming texts blames America in a vacuum. They don't talk about the global problem, assuming one even exists. They don't talk about it. They don't cite other countries that pollute. The warming, the climate damage is exclusively portrayed as an American problem. The last little essay, how about that one by the time your kid's a sophomore? The evolution of the grocery bag. A long essay, and a spoiler alert, paper and plastic are both bad, and America's destroying the planet. How about this? How about your kids are going to be reading, instead of great works of literature now, they're going to be reading President Obama's own executive orders in Common Core English. Executive Order 13423, strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. And as Sandy points out, you're getting much more indoctrination within text because the federal government is handing what kids are going to read to teachers without any balance, and you can't bring in, if you're in a Common Core classroom, as teachers are finding out because of the test, you can't bring in an essay to challenge that. It'll never appear on the tests. More informational text, less classic literature, we also know, and it's common sense. Kids learn how to write well only after they learn how to read well. When you go to learn a foreign language, you don't start by writing it. But at every single grade level, Common Core English lowers the overall level of reading by 50%. And elevates the level of writing by 50%. Kids are writing more than they're reading. And if you're not reading anything except government propaganda, what do you think you're going to be writing about all the time? That's it. Maybe that's why we got that very famous viral example that a couple months ago, right, where little kids were sent home with the third graders. They were sent home with the assignment to write an essay. How is the state just like the family, but better? Right? Or that's where you get essays like Hitler versus Bush. Common Core, they did a little module on how, the only thing they told the kids about George Bush was how he lied to get us into Iraq. That's all they said. And then they showed how Hitler lied to create World War II. The kids were sent home with an assignment, right? Here's what the assignment read. Now that you've seen two powerful men who lied and abused their power, compare George Bush and Adolf Hitler. This is what you're doing. Here's my second debit. You give me one, so I've given you two already. Common Core is a stool with three legs. Common Core is an alliance between a very small group of capitalists, not crony capitalists, not free market capitalists, and the federal government. Here's the third definition of Common Core, and I think it's an important one. If you give me just one word to define what it is, that word would be statism. The entire premise of all of this is not to educate your kids. Not first and foremost, it's not. It is to convince your kids that they belong first and foremost to the state. Not to you, not to your families, not to your local communities, certainly not to your religious traditions, but to them. All of this subordinates that. And math, it's the same thing with math. Oh, I'm sorry, before we go leave English. And of that little bit of literature, relatively speaking, that's left in Common Core, why is so much of it sexually inappropriate, graphic, violent? Why, of what little literature is left in Common Core, as you heard the liberal Kat say, as you heard the liberal Lewis say, why is so much of it so shockingly developmentally inappropriate? Here's an example. This is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Morrison is a great writer. She's a Nobel Prize winner. But we wouldn't assign this book to freshmen in college. It's about a 12-year-old girl who's a victim of rape and incest. And over the course of the novel, she comes to bond with her rapist so much that she starts describing in graphic detail the nature of their sexual encounters. This book has been pulled out of middle school classrooms, 8th graders, Catholic 8th graders, reading this book in Common Core textbooks. I blocked out the worst words. You may not be able to read it. It's probably just as well. But if you can get a quick sense of just what middle schoolers, adolescents are reading in Common Core. And as Sandy points out, Sandy Stotsky, there are dozens and dozens of books like this, equally graphic. Books like Black Swan, Dreaming in Cuban, that are Common Core exemplar texts. And for the youngest kids, they're not reading hardcore pornography like this, but they're reading things just as bad. How about that assignment that came out just a couple weeks ago, where kids were, a group of kids, I think they were 4th graders, were sent home with a paragraph, 8-sentence paragraph, 4th graders. They had to read the paragraph and then write what the theme was. A sensible argument, get kids to read a paragraph and see if they can figure out what it means. Well, here's how the paragraph for 4th graders began. Janie's mom came home from work early one day. Janie's mom found that the family bed wasn't made. As Janie's mom set about making the bed, she found a hair beret between the sheets that wasn't hers. 8 sentences later, 4th graders had to conclude that dad was having an adulterous affair in mom's bed for 4th graders. Even math questions have been skewed. Even math now has been sexualized in the way they ask the questions. How about that famous example from a little while ago in Detroit, Michigan, where little kids were doing a ratio assignment? I think they were 3rd or 4th graders too. They were doing, they were 6th graders. They were doing a ratio assignment, percentages. And there was a little stick figure drawing of a woman and 3 little stick figure drawings of men. The woman was sleeping with all 3 men. So the students in 6th grade had to determine the percentage of which of the 3 men were the baby daddy. And they used the word baby daddy. Why are math? Remember what I said to you about math? If math, we've been doing math the same way for 2,000 years. What are you doing when you change it? You're not changing the math. All you're changing is this aspect of it, the sociology accompanied with it. Sandy says, right? We need to explore why. Why so many of these exemplar readings are out of place. Not just in the subject area Common Core puts them, but in a high school curriculum altogether. What are they doing there? And in talking to Professor Milgram about math, we're at number 9, let's do number 10. Let's blow up the 10th Common Core myth. Well, Common Core math has been internationally benchmarked. That we've meant, do you know, and you keep hearing this from your schools and your politicians, Milgram showed up at the committee and he said, okay, you keep saying that Common Core math, you measured it against all the high-achieving math countries. What countries? And so they handed him a list, right? Sweden, South Korea, Taiwan, all the countries where kids really, really do excel at math. And Milgram said, great, now let me see your math. How did you do it? For the entire month he was on that committee, nobody ever presented a slightest piece of evidence, none, zero, that this had ever been benchmarked by anything. As a matter of fact, as you sit here today, 5 years into Common Core, the government has produced no evidence, none, that any of this was ever measured against anything. It's one of the reasons Milgram voted no. Sandy said, we were convinced on the committee that all they did was write down names of countries. There is no evidence. Your kids are guinea pigs. None of this has ever been tested anywhere. All right, it's one of the reasons Milgram voted no. So in talking to Professor Milgram, we got to talking. Professor, if this is not primarily about teaching kids math, what is it? His words, this is social justice math. It's not fair that only a small percentage of kids can do math at a high level, and hasn't that always been true? I mean, let's face reality here, right? You're not going to turn most American kids into math whizzes. We all should have a competent math background, I agree. I didn't even get that. But the fact remains is that most kids aren't going to do math at the level you're going to need to do it to be an engineer or an architect or even a doctor. Most kids aren't going to do that math. At the universities I've taught at, you know where my English majors mostly come from? Pre-med kids who couldn't do the math and had to drop out of the doctor program, right? That's the reality. Math is hard, but that's unfair. It's socially unjust that only some kids can do math. So we've created a math program, a math curriculum, where everybody knows a very little math and nobody's allowed to succeed or excel in math. Pointing to this, Professor Milgram says, here's some evidence for it. This young woman, and you cannot make this up, she's a community activist organizer in Chicago. And she's talking to a group of Illinois high school math teachers about the philosophy of Common Core math.
Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the way we...
Right. Philosophically, right answers don't matter as much as the process. One of the primary ways Common Core is being taught, math is being taught at elementary levels, is the Parent Share program, where teachers who are facilitators, they don't teach, put kids in little groups of 2 and 3, they give them math problems. And the purpose is not to get the right answer. The purpose is to simply get all 3 kids to agree what they think the answer is. Got a little boy, a little 3rd grader in New York, on a multiplication test, 7 times 6, he writes 42. He gets it marked wrong. And in red pencil, the teacher writes, the other 2 children in your peer group agreed on a different answer. So they got it marked right. You did not agree with the other kids, so we got it marked wrong. Another 4th grade boy had a math problem in New York, too, where the answer was 111. He got it marked wrong simply because he wrote the number in. What he was supposed to do was draw 111 circles to get the answer right, because he didn't do that. I know, come on, you don't believe it. All right, watch this, quickly. Here's a college math professor, Milgram knows her. She can't help her 3rd grader with math. So she puts the 3rd grade girl at the board, has her work a math problem, and watch the Common Core way. Here's the hard math problem. Add these 3 numbers. 1568, 1423, and 680.
So what I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school?
Okay.
And talk to me while you're solving it.
So we learned that a big square like this is 100. So we could make that 100 into a cube, which would make 1,000. So I'm going to do that.
Turn up the volume.
So a square is 100, then a cube is 1,000.
So let's just say that's 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And now we still have to do 500. Could make that into 5 sheets.
Do you notice how nobody's adding things yet? This is just what you have to do to get the first number on the board.
And we have 60.
The lines equal 10, the dots equal 1. Now you're going to have to add the second number before you can start doing the problem.
For her birthday, she got 1,000. The dots represent 1.
Okay.
So now we have to add all of these together. So you could make 1,000. All of these together is 400. Now you need 600 more. So now I'm going to write the numbers down. So we have 1,000 plus, well, let's just say 3,000, because we have 3 cubes. 3,000 plus 100. So So we can just add, that gives us a total of 3,763.
Okay. Now that problem you just solved took about 8 minutes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what we're doing in school. But at home, I'm taught how to stack. And we're not allowed to do stacking in school. That's why we have to.
You are prohibited
Okay.
from doing this kind of math in Common Core. The way we learn how to do it.
Which is way easy.
You cannot do this in Common Core. You get it marked wrong if you do. You are prohibited from doing it.
What are you thinking? You're looking at your problem.
In the interest of time, she got 2 different answers. She did the stacking correctly, took about 30 seconds. She took 8 minutes to get it wrong, Common Core's way. And you know, as bad a math student as I am, if every time you did Common Core math, a square equaled 100 and a cube equaled 1,000, I could figure it out, but it's never the same way twice. It's all this screwy stuff. And as Pilgrim points out, if you're spending, how much time does it take to put kids in little groups without being taught by teachers? How much time does it take to draw all that junk on the board? In every high-achieving math country on earth, all of them, kids routinely begin algebra, serious algebra, in 7th or even 6th grade. In No Child Left Behind America, our America kids weren't beginning real algebra until 8th grade. And under Common Core, algebra is routinely pushed into high school, which means your kids will not get advanced math and calculus anymore. And here, this will blow you away. The name Jason Zimba, Z-I-M-B-A, he is the architect of Common Core math. He is the man most responsible for Common Core math, Zimba. And if you type into the Google, Sandy Stotsky and debates Jason Zimba, she gets him to admit publicly, the man who wrote the math standards, that it's true. Common Core math will not prepare your kids for college level math. He says, at the best, it will prepare the brightest kids, maybe to begin math at a 2-year technical college. High schools all across the country in the last 6 months have been pulling calculus classes out of the curriculum because your kids will never get there. There's one school that took calculus out, and guess what they replaced it with at senior level? A mandatory math class on how to promote diversity through mathematics. Do you see what Milgram's telling you now? This is not a paradigm to allow kids to excel in math. This is let's get everybody to the same place, which means it's got to be a low standard. And you don't think I'm telling you the truth about this. There are 22 different states that have done this already. School boards all across the country are warning and threatening moms and dads not to, in any way, shape, or form, let your kids do any extra math. This is Orange County, California, the Irvine Unified School District in Orange County. Moms and dads in California were freaking out because their 4th grade kids weren't able to add or subtract independently of all that drawing. So they started getting tutors for their kids. And the school district freaked out. Here's the warning. The links on this page are intended to support the classroom instruction that your child receives from his teacher. It is not appropriate to go ahead of classroom instruction or to use this site to have your kid work on math that is intended for subsequent grades. Don't do it. And here's the threat. Your child's math instruction and math placement will not change as a result of working ahead. This means that your child will continue to work in grade level appropriate math regardless of any other work that's done. So your 3rd grader can be ready for geometry, tough. He's going to spend the next 7 years drawing circles and cubes and squares. Doesn't matter. Under this, right, no one gets to move ahead. We've lost more gifted and talented programs in this country in the last 2 years than in the last 40 because that's not socially just. It's not socially just that some kids take honors classes and others don't. This is what Common Core math is. And as you see, as with the English, this is pure sociology. It's not education. I'm going to skip over the data mining stuff, just in the interest of time. I know I know that's a good one, but to be fair to the other speakers, I want to close with this. Equally as bad as Common Core is all the junk you're going to get with it. These are the National Sexuality Education Standards. They were published by the federal government the very same year Common Core began to be implemented in the schools in 2012. Notice the title. These are the national standards, which means they're national, the feds own it. They're standards, which means your kids are going to have to be tested on it. When do they start? When your kids are 5 years old. 5 years old. The federal government is now teaching sex to your kids. Notice the subtitle. These are the core skills, the core content. Now, is that Common Core? The schools will tell you it's not, but then you can find this document online. You open this document to the 6th page, and it tells you that when the sexuality standards were being written, what did they use to construct them? Look at the last thing on the list. Common Core standards for English and math. Why in the world is the national sexuality standards, the curriculum, the national sex requirements now, why are they modeling themselves and incorporating Common Core English and math? What does English and math have to do with sex? Well, you now know the question, don't you? Why is there so much sex in your English textbooks? Why is there so much pornography? Why are math problems being rewritten and sexualized? Because they have to be. We don't put 5-year-olds in biology class, and we don't put 5-year-olds in sex ed. If they're going to start teaching this stuff to your kids, Common Core is the mechanism whereby they do it. And you know how I know that? They don't cite any non-Common Core subjects. You would think the national sexuality standards, if they were going to cite some kind of lower level curriculum, wouldn't they have cited the science standards? Biology. Why don't they cite those? Because they weren't Common Core in 2012. In 2012, all we had was Common Core math and English. In other words, Common Core is a Trojan horse. It's a placeholder to begin the teaching of sex in English. Because if you're going to get 5-year-olds to these kind of standards, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, you have to make sex part of every single subject and every single lesson. Here's what they do. They break your kids up into 3-year cycles. 5, 6, 7-year-olds test. 8, 9, 10-year-olds test. Here's some of the standards for the 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. So by the time your daughter is 7, she will be forced to identify different kinds of family structures, and then demonstrate ways to show respect for different types of families. Do you teach your 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds about gay marriage? Because they're going to now. And that second one should chill you. Who gets to describe what respect is? If you come from a Christian home, or a Catholic home, or a Jewish home, or an Islamic home, what if you teach your kids to respect everybody, but that marriage is exclusively between a man and a woman? You're not going to be able to answer that, are you? But it's meaningless, because at age 5 and 6 and 7, little kids can't process this. They don't understand it. You're not teaching kids about sex at this age. You're indoctrinating them. You're brainwashing them. And you don't teach your kids sex at that age. So you got your kids in kindergarten. Kindergarten. Remember what Josh Cat said? You got your kids in kindergarten, and they're going to start getting sex. It's already happening. So you're going to teach your kids sex too to combat this? Well, then they've won, because you're sexualizing your children. Or you don't, and you're going to let the schools do it, because these are national standards, right? How about this? By the time your daughter is 7, she's going to describe similarities and differences in how boys and girls may be expected to act. Because if math is neither true nor false, then neither is biology, and there is no such thing as gender. We're convincing kids now at 5 and 6 and 7 that there are no boys and there are no girls. It's all just a social construct. Now look at the wild one. Look at the ridiculousness. You got 6-year-olds, right? You're going to ask your 6-year-olds to provide examples of how friends, family, media, society, and culture influence ways boys and girls think they should act. How does a 6-year-old get her mind around this? How about this? By the time your son is 10, before he even hits puberty, by the time he's in 5th grade, look at the next one, the bottom one. He will define sexual orientation as the romantic attraction of an individual to someone of the same gender or someone of a different gender. That's mandatory. In other words, the federal government is telling your kids how they must define it in order to meet the standard. There's no debate, there's no conscience here, there's no critical thinking here. Your kids, by the time they're 10, will be forced to parrot that. And look, whatever you think about homosexuality, this is your job, isn't it? This is the family's job, isn't it? What in the world is the federal government doing here? And if you call this up online, it will blow you away how staggeringly inappropriate this is. And the other thing I'd like to point out, none of this has anything to do with biology or birth control. This is pure sociology. And the last thing I'm going to do is going to prove that to you. This is the most shocking slide, and I'm done when I'm done with it, that I'm going to show you, and it's pretty extreme. This poster I'm about to show you hangs on the wall in a middle school in Shawnee, Kansas. Middle of the Bible Belt. It's not Madison, Wisconsin, or Miami-Dade. This is Shawnee, Kansas. This poster has been there all last year, every day. It was a 6th grader, an 11-year-old, who took the picture as it sits on the wall next to a picture of Clifford the big red dog. Took the picture, brought it home to Dad. Here's the poster. Sorry, there we go, there's the poster. How do people express their sexual feelings? And look at what's on the list. Did you know that saying I like you now, according to the federal government, is sexual? Holding hands is sex. Did you know that? This is such a Common Core English assignment. Do you notice how they've got talking up there twice? They don't even bother to proofread. This poster hangs there every day, all day, 8 hours a day. And do you notice what else they have on the list besides kissing and saying I like you? I'm not going to read some of those words. Do you understand that for a public school system that is obsessed with sex birth control to the point of fetishization, there's nothing on this list that suggests some of these things might lead to pregnancy, or some of these things might lead to disease? You know what this is? This is the federal government convincing your kids that if they object to any one of those things, and what 11-year-old's going to think that saying I like you is bad? If they object to any of those things, they object to all of them. But if they accept any one of those as legitimate, they have to accept them all. 11-year-olds. And even more shocking than this is what happened when Dad complained. Dad freaked out. Here's the response from the middle school. This is from Hawker Grove Middle School spokeswoman Leanne Neal of Shawnee, Kansas, the Bible Belt. The poster that you reference is actually part of our middle school health and science curriculum. What did you see on that poster that dealt with health? What did you see on that poster that dealt with science? So you see what's happening with the coming science standards, right? Just like math is not about math, it's about social justice. Just like English is not about values and experiences, it's all about indoctrination. Even science and health have been degraded to propaganda sociology in the name of science. So where did it come from? Spokeswoman said, the curriculum it is a part of aligns with the national standards. And that's why they can't take it down. This is going to happen here, Florida. How can you got state and local control? This stuff gets into your schools. If it's part of a national standard that has to be measured nationally, how are your teachers going to be authorized to take it out? They can't. Your principals can't do it. It's part of the national standard. Your superintendent of state schools can't pull it out. And that's what they told the dad in Kansas. We can't pull it out. It's part of the national standard that we've adopted. Your kids have to meet these standards. And so when school started again this year, the poster's still there. This is just the beginning. It's just getting ratcheted up here. I'm out of time. There are so many things in Common Core you have to be worried about. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And if even 5% of what you've heard here today is true, if I am just a colossal liar and only 5% is true, that is 5% that should make you really, really want to slow down and challenge the people who are putting it in your schools. How we got here, why we got here, and why we're doing this. Thank you for listening.